In this episode, I want to talk about the threat to Western democracy and the threat to capitalism, the threat to the system in general. And I'm going to give you my conclusion and then discuss why I'm even doing this episode. So my conclusion is that the biggest threat to Western democracy is the behavior of the US government and also Western European governments. So the threat is from within. It's not China, it's not Russia, it's not nuclear war, none of that stuff. I'm not diminishing the risk of these things, but the biggest threat is the actual policy that we're seeing in the US and in Europe. I'm going to focus on the US, just a few mentioned about Europe, but I'm going to focus on the US. In particular, the large debt and the large deficits that our government is incurring all the time and continues to doing, and pre-COVID and now even worse after COVID, those are the big threats. So for all the strategists out there, for all the DC security, cybersecurity, whatever security strategist you are, whatever you're focused on, whatever C-suites, executive board meeting, or whatever you're having and whatever you're discussing in terms of the threats, your main problem is at home. Fix yourself at home. This is the best way to strengthen yourself if you are concerned about things like, for example, the threat of China. We believe that the threat of China is not the kind of threat where a rogue regime will attack us or something like that. The threat of China is simply that they are focusing on a highly efficient meritocracy there and getting better at what they do, and at some point will take us over because they're faster and we're slowing down. This is the biggest threat, and this is what we need to fix. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's January 7th, 2023. This is Krim Delko. It's a Saturday. There's no update for the year. We are down 6.9%. The market is up 1.5%. We're underperforming by 8.4%. The biggest threat to our Western system, to our democracy, to our sense for free expression and freedom and free action and free deployment of capital and all of these things that we all consider Western democracy or Western capitalism, the biggest threat is from within. It's actually the threat of the Western nihilism and the Western anti-freedom movement, which has many facets. We consider that the biggest threat and not, let's say, the threat of China and Russia and all these things. So I want to discuss this now in several points. First, I want to motivate the discussion. Why is there even a discussion? And then I want to discuss the actual point. So why is there even a discussion? We have a lot of sort of geopolitical talk right now since the attack to the Ukraine by Russia, and then recently the threat of China, and all of these things are accumulating into this narrative that we have a problem with the outside world, that we have to compete with geopolitical adversaries, in particular with Russia. Now, I personally don't think that that's such a big risk because I feel like China is part of this game. It's not, as opposed to Russia, that is not really winning in the game and therefore has incentive to be sort of a vandal or a rogue player. The Chinese don't have that incentive because they are actually winners. They have a strong economy, they have technologies, they are competitive, and they don't need to destroy the system. They can play the system. All they have to do is play the system, which means take all the benefits from the system, such as, for example, competition, survival of the fittest, and all of these things, and then maybe not play by the rules in other areas such as IP and all these things. And those are things we need to fix. I'm not saying we should just stand by and let China do whatever they want, but I'm just saying they are not the biggest threat. The biggest threat to Western democracy as we see it is coming from within. Now, let me first define, what do I mean? What is the objective, the political objective or the social objective of what we call Western democracy? I think Western democracy is the thing that allows for free expression and voluntary free behavior, and behavior in terms of economic behavior in terms of social and private behavior. You can marry whoever you want, you can walk around the way you want, you can do business the way you want, you can start businesses the way you want, you can compete wherever you want, capital can flow freely from one place to the other. Those are the kinds of things that we stand for at Orange Capital Partners, and that we think are necessary to be protected. Now, that is also what the threat is. The threat comes from within, in particular from two places. One is the more politically obvious one, let's say what's called wokeism now in the US, or generally what's called political correctness, where we try to influence the outcome by things like quotas or by not allowing certain types of speech. All of those things are orthogonal to the idea of a free Western democracy. So that's one of the threats. But the much bigger threat is actually the wasteful financial situation that we're in. The large debt and the large deficits of our government are by far the biggest threat to our stability and our democracy. If I'm a Chinese rogue dictator, I'm just going to stand by and watch ourselves destroy ourselves by just wasting all this money on futile so-called defense spending, which is futile in the sense it doesn't really help our defense, or on all this wealth distribution that is just siphoning money out of the system into God knows where, and it's not even helping the people that it's supposed to help. So those are the kind of the two things. We just finished an essay. It's not published yet, so I'm going to discuss it more thoroughly. The working title is Industrial Policy is Crony Fallacy, which just means it's a critique on President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which by itself is appalling. Just the name itself. Government is not in the business of reducing inflation. In fact, it's the opposite. Government is almost exclusively actively increasing inflation. In particular, the Biden government is increasing inflation by having large deficits, by fostering false, not false, but misguided response to COVID and post-COVID reaction. In other words, just spending money on all kinds of initiatives that have no purpose and no goal, in particularly no purpose of improving the economic well-being of the country. It is pure crony capitalism helping certain constituency. In our essay, we talk about the EV tax credit, which is basically a blunt, shameless attempt to slow down the progress of Tesla, which is in light of the fact that Biden is supporting the UAW, which is a constituency of the Democratic Party, and therefore it's just a shameless pork barrel. And it's just one example. It's the peak of the iceberg. There's a lot more than that. We have a 30+ trillion debt. We have $1 trillion deficit. So the EV tax credit is only a small part, but it's a big sign of what's going on. And we believe that this is the biggest threat to our democracy, to the freedom of expression and the freedom of action, freedom of behavior, and freedom of deploying capital, which is the most important aspect of a free democracy. We can only improve the general condition of our nation and generally the world if we abide to the rules of free capitalism, because that is where wealth is created. Every other conversation about how we distribute wealth, how we change our hierarchies, all of these things are luxuries that can only be earned by wealth creation. Wealth creation is the necessary condition for all these things. So if we kill the goose that lays the golden egg, then we have nothing else to discuss about. So for all the strategists out there, for all the security strategists, for all the military strategists, and all the people who warn us all the time that how dangerous China is, or how dangerous Russia is, or how dangerous X and Y, you fill in the blanks. The fundamental problem is from within. The problem that we face as a Western democracy is the anti-Western, anti-freedom movement within our own circles. And now, what do we do about that? Well, first, we actually mention it. So I'd be happy to hear, for example, the now Republican House, which is part of the Congress, but the important part, to start talking about the deficit and to curb the deficit. I'd be happy to hear more, prominent investors on Wall Street talk about the main problem is not the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, it's the government creating inflation by having large deficits and also hiring a lot of people, which is tightening the labor market. Of course, we have a tight labor market when the government is spending $1 trillion on wasteful, jobs. If we didn't have that, and we'd had just, here in Silicon Valley, where there's no wasteful government spending, we have a decline in jobs, we have a decline in demand, decline in rentals, decline in housing prices, because here there's a real economy. But in most parts of the country, that's not the case. So the biggest risk to inflation, the financial markets, and wealth creation is from within. It's our own government. The same applies to Europe, where there is a lot more wealth distribution and mission creep by governments going on, because it's amplified by the misguided design of the EU. I don't want to go into too much detail there. I just want to mention that the fact that the over-indebtedness of the governments in Europe is crippling the economy and creating massive unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, which is an untenable situation for the continent, and therefore also its own demise. Now, we here in the US are not as bad. We have options. We can curb the spending. We can channel the resources towards productive investment and productive, innovative projects. That's what the US has always been good at, and that's what we're propagating, that we focus more on that instead of creating this enemy of China or Russia or whatever, cybersecurity and all these things. We have to take them seriously, but that's not our biggest concern. Our biggest concern is from within. It's our own government. It's our own propensity to spend more than we make as a government, and by the way, it goes across the aisle. Right now, it's the Democrats. 10, 15 years ago, the wokeism of today was the terrorism of back then. It was very similar. We overspent on projects that were supposed to mitigate back then the threat of terror, and today we're spending a lot monetary but also social capital on let's say wokeism, which is some sort of attempt to generate outcomes instead of letting the fruits of labor and the fruits of creativity develop and then let the chips fall on the table. We try to generate the outcome, which is just another word for collectivism, and that is hindering our progress. That is hindering also our ability to create wealth in order to distribute that wealth more fairly in the future. So again, to summarize, the biggest threat to the free flow of capital, the free flow of ideas, and the free flow of human endeavor is coming from within. It's not rogue states in East Asia or something. It is actually the threat from within, the threat from our own governments and our own propensity to spend more money than we make. Thank you.